my capacity as a history and archives program volunteer. I want to give a quick shout out to our team. So just raise your hand if you're on Brenda Montano's archives team of all-stars. Amelia, Ned. I know Diane Peterson is back there. I know I'm missing someone else, but welcome. So before we jump into the Olmsted stuff, it's really my pleasure. Well, actually, I do want to say there's some special guests. Not that you all aren't special and that we don't have VIPs, but there's some very, very special guests, and I'm kind of just tingling with excitement to tell you more about it. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce our board member for Ward 1 for East Bay Regional Parks, and she's going to kick us off officially. So we will have officially begun this event, and that's Director Elizabeth Eccles. And we're sort of arguing whether I get to tell this or she does, and I think we're both going to tell you this. But you know, the very first interpretive program of this agency began right here by a guy named Ranger Jack Parker. This was 1947, 1949. Now, I'm not saying Director Eccles was in that first program, but she was a kid in the Junior Ranger program, and that goes a long way with us. It's very exciting. But she's done other things, and she's been a fan and friend of East Bay Regional Parks for a whole long time. She's worked in 2 governors' administration, Governor Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom, and she's directed herself towards climate change, environmental protection, fire mitigation, fire prevention, and those kind of issues. So please give a hand to our director, Elizabeth Eccles, for Ward 1.
Well, thank you, Dave, for that very kind introduction, and welcome back. I know you haven't really gone away, but welcome back. And welcome to all of you. It's so good to see everyone here today. It's a beautiful evening for us. So I'm going to begin with the land acknowledgement and recognition of the native tribes that preceded us on this land where we're here today. We are within Huchun territory on the unceded lands of the Ohlone peoples, the managers and stewards of this land since time immemorial. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land that they remain intrinsically connected to. Please join me in recognizing and honoring this land and the Huchun Ohlone people who are integral members of the Bay Area community as they continue their traditional cultural practices and thrive on the land they are so deeply connected to. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to take a moment to recognize my fellow Park District board members who are here. Thank you so much for being here. President Colin Coffey, Board Vice President Beverly Lane. We have also Board Treasurer Dennis Waspy, I think, is around here. Yes, hi Dennis, and board member Ellen Corbett, thank you. And we also have some other very special guests that will be speaking that you'll be hearing from later on in the program, and this includes our Regional Parks Foundation Board Vice President Les Hausreth, our National Association for Olmsted Parks Advisory Committee member and Park District General Manager Emeritus Bob Doyle, Save the Redwoods League President and CEO Sam Hodder, and of course you've already met our retired Park District Regional Interpretive and Recreation Services Manager Dave Zuckerman, who is also our MC tonight. And we're also honored to have some additional special guests here, but it sounded like Dave might be planning to recognize them, so maybe we're gonna fight over this too, because you guys are all so special. Well, I'm just gonna start because I don't wanna miss anyone, and then he can also fill in. So I know we have Holly Potter from the Regional Parks Foundation board member. She's a board member. Also John Martin, Regional Parks Foundation board member. We have a number of the Olmsted family here tonight. Very, very pleased to have them with us. We have Mary Jordan, who is Olmsted Jr.'s granddaughter. Dr. Sarah Gill, also Olmsted's Jr.'s granddaughter, Jane Gill, Olmsted's Jr. granddaughter, and we also have great-granddaughter Patty Ramos and great-great-granddaughter Olivia Ramos. So just yeah, thank you so much for being here. Ellen Barth from Citizens for East Shore Parks Board is here, and let's see, Kate Donovan, UC Berkeley Bancroft Library Director, Rick Rickard, PAC member, and then I'm going to quickly acknowledge some of our staff. Jim O'Connor, Deputy General Manager, is here, and Kassenbaum, Acting Assistant General Manager for Public Affairs, and thank you, Anne, for taking that on in addition to everything else you do. And we're also very fortunate to have our new Assistant General Manager for Public Affairs, Susan Chu. I'm looking forward to having you on board. Steve Castile, Acting Assistant General Manager for Operations. Tiffany Margalucci, Acting Chief of Interpretation and Recreation Services. Mike Moran, Regional Interpretive and Recreation Services Manager. And Sarah Federley, the EEC Supervising Naturalist. So that was a pretty long list, and I could mention everybody here because you're all special guests, and we really appreciate you being here tonight. So, thanks again for joining us for this celebration of the nationally renowned landscape architects Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., his son Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and the Olmsted Brothers architecture firm. We're here to celebrate Olmsted Sr.'s 200th birthday and his profound influence on parks and open space landscapes across the country. And I want to start by reflecting on a really truly visionary quote from the 1930 report by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who's the son of Olmsted Sr., and Ansel Hall. And this report, which was called Proposed Park Reservations for East Bay Cities, is viewed by many as the founding document of the East Bay Regional Park District. And what they wrote was, "The need is a vital one. The charm of the region as a place in which to live will depend largely upon natural conditions that are destined to disappear unless properly protected for the public in general." So if you just think now about what this would look like if they and others hadn't worked to preserve it all, if these hills were all covered with houses and apartments and office buildings, really we owe them a debt of gratitude. So really want to appreciate that. And of course, the Park District's roots lie in Olmsted and Hall's vision for grand nature parks in the East Bay. And that vision continues to inspire us today. And today, the East Bay Regional Park District is the largest of its kind in the nation, with 73 regional parks and over 125,000 acres of open space. However, the Park District is more than just the parks and open space that we manage and steward. The Park District was founded with Olmsted's vision of parks for all people, the idea that everyone, regardless of economic circumstances, deserves access to parks. And at the Park District, we've worked really hard to connect people to parks, especially our underserved youth, through many present-day district initiatives like Healthy Parks, Healthy People, naturalist programs, and other community outreach programs that help introduce children and family to nature. And these programs, you may be familiar with some of them, they include Parks Express, which is a partnership with the Regional Parks Foundation that provides transportation for low-income schools and groups serving children from under-resourced families, seniors, and people with disabilities to access our parks. We, along with the foundation, provide more than $400,000 annually in support of this transportation. And also, you've just heard about the Park District's Junior Ranger program, which is nearly 75 years old. And no, I was not in the first class, but I was, well, I won't even tell you which one I was in, but it was a while ago. It was before Dave Zuckerman was in charge of the program. So, but anyway, it provides youth ages 9 to 18 with a classroom in the woods to connect in nature. And I still have very fond memories of being here in the Nature Center, being up there in that little house up there somewhere, which was our classroom. And it really, you know, I think having that opportunity to serve as a junior ranger and be out here in nature as a child, it really gave me the opportunity to experience firsthand how programs like this can create a deep love and appreciation for our natural environment and the commitment to preserve it for future generations. So in addition to the Junior Ranger program, we also have the Adventure Crew Richmond Rangers, which introduces youth ages 11 to 13 from under-resourced communities to nature and recreation, learning about hiking, fishing, boating, backpacking, and also just the opportunity to spend time in nature, which we know is so important for health and well-being. And of course, we also continue to work to provide public access to parks by opening new parks in close proximity to underserved communities, as well as creating access to our beautiful shoreline parks with safe pedestrian and bicycle bridges for communities that were once separated from parks by freeways and railway tracks. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples because I don't want to go on for too long. We've got a really really important program here, so I'll just call out a few. So, for example, the Dotson Family Marsh Restoration and Public Access Project out at Point Pinole. We restored the habitat, we planned for climate change, we provided new shoreline access for underserved residents out in North Richmond, and also at Point Pinole, we enhanced park access by creating a bridge over railroad tracks to a new staging area, and this is also where we'll provide infrastructure for a future service yard and visitor center. We recently opened Brickyard Cove in Berkeley, which also provides access for not just folks from West Berkeley, but from around the area. And we're working with Caltrans and other partners to provide a pedestrian bicycle overpass that will improve safety and public access to the bay shoreline. So looking ahead, I have to also just mention something that I'm very excited about the potential to move forward on the Park District's long-held vision for a true regional shoreline park out at Point Mulate. And we're really happy that State Senator Nancy Skinner recently got $36 million in the state budget to help move that vision forward. We have a long way to go, but it's certainly an important step forward. And Point Mulate is particularly important because it has the potential to improve equitable access to parkland by creating a true bayfront regional park in a city that's over 80% people of color. So today we have our opportunity to really recognize the Olmsted movement and its role and impact on the East Bay Regional Park District. And you'll be hearing from a lot of speakers who will give you the background on that and the history. And so I will just wrap up by saying that we are really proud of the Park District's place in the Olmsted movement, and we are thrilled to participate in Olmsted 200, celebrating parks for all people, to bring awareness to Frederick Law Olmsted Sr.'s legacy. Thank you again for being here today, and I really appreciate that all of you took the time to join us this evening.
Thank you so much, Director Eccles, and thanks for all you do, your dedication and vision for the Park District. Before I introduce the next speaker, I want to correct an oversight or two. This is all just sort of happening as this evening unfolds, and we're all trying to keep abreast of these special guests that have come. And so Director Eccles introduced some of them, but my understanding is, sorry, I have to look at my cheat sheet, because I'm telling you, if you look at Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., Jr., the children of each, stepchildren and grandchildren and nephews and nieces. I'm sure you guys can keep it straight, but I'm just learning. So I hope you will bear with us. Cyrus, I understand, I believe you're a 4G guy. Is this true? So you're the great, 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 great grandson of junior or senior?
Senior, yeah.
Wow. I mean, how amazing is that we're here talking about an iconic family, an iconic Olmsted Brothers firm, and we have a whole couple front row seats of direct descendants. It's really amazing. So, and actually Sarah Federley, who's our supervisor here, is a college friend with Patty Ramos. And Rick, so there you go. In fact, she introduced them, right? So good job, Sarah. So I don't want to detract from the Olmsted legacy because that's what we're celebrating, but there is an unsung hero that kind of goes along with the two main guys. And you may not have heard his name, but we're going to talk about him briefly. But there's two other descendants. This was a man named Ansel Hall. And he was, actually, I won't go on the whole story, but all these stories are fascinating, but he was the very first ranger, I believe, for National Park Service in 1917, and they sent him up to Sequoia, and I read like a little account of it, and I think he took a dog and an axe and not much else, and he was in charge of patrolling those lands. And he was the first guy. He went on to be in charge of the whole field division of forestry and education. He got into building topo maps, like relief models, built the first visitor center in Yosemite. His granddaughter, Joanna Hall, please raise your hand. She is here. And Ansel Hall's grandson, Ashley Hall, is here as well. They were here for the dedication of our relief model. We have one of the Ansel Hall original maps, and we're going to talk about it briefly. Okay, anybody else? All righty. So it is my pleasure to introduce the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Regional Parks Foundation. And Les Houserath is a former attorney who actually represented the Park District. As I say, he's retired now from his legal work, but he's working on the foundation. So where is, there we are. All right, thank you, Les.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave mentioned, I am the Vice President of the Regional Parks Foundation Board, and we are very pleased and honored to take part in this celebration of the Olmsted's outstanding legacy of influence on parks and open space landscapes here in the Bay Area and across the country. I was just in North Carolina a couple of months ago, and there was at the Biltmore Estate, there was, that was another Olmsted project, so it was great. You go everywhere and you can find the work of the family, so it's fantastic. The Regional Park Foundation is a 501c3 organization which supports the East Bay Regional Park District through fundraising to provide universal access, environmental stewardship, education, and recreational programs, as well as the acquisition of parklands. The foundation, which was founded over 50 years ago, maintains a very strong partnership with the Park District. And as a 501c3 organization, the foundation can and does accept tax-deductible donations to directly benefit the vital Park District programs. It can also accept donations of land with the same tax benefits, which land is then transferred to the district for management and operation, because this is important. There are, in terms of the legalities of it all, sometimes easier, better to give land to a 501c3 nonprofit than to a public entity, which the Park District is. Director Eckel stole a tiny bit of my thunder, but I'm going to just talk about a few of the examples of the programs that are directly funded by the foundation. Summer day camps, Camp Arroyo, which is an overnight program, including we provide scholarships to disadvantaged youth. Now, some of these programs have been temporarily disadvantaged by COVID, but we're hoping to get everything kind of back on track and back with all of the active programs. Another one of the things that we do or we fund is universal access, including the Parks Express program, which Director Eccles mentioned, which provides transportation to the parks for those without their own means, which is important because a lot of the parks are like here or like parks up in the higher up in the Oakland Hills are not necessarily close to people who might want to go there and literally don't have a way to get there. The bus service and system is not suitable for that. Senior outreach programs geared toward the senior population, obviously. A program we instituted a couple of years ago. We are now giving free memberships to disadvantaged youth, particularly youth of color. This was a program that was actually put together in the light of the beginning of the George Floyd, the whole situation, Black Lives Matter, and in conjunction with the celebration of Juneteenth. And we give memberships to organizations who then distribute them to youth, and they can come and use the parks, and we're very excited about that. Multicultural wellness walks, which are extremely popular. Mona Coe, if anyone who knows Mona, she's like a dynamo, and she runs these walks, and they're fantastic. And a lot of programs to protect biological, recreational, historical resources. As I said, Director Eccles mentioned a lot of the things she mentioned, not all, but many of those are funded. Through that we contribute, the foundation doesn't run any of these programs, but raises money from individuals and corporations, which is very important. The foundation also has a membership program, well over 10,000 members, which provides, you can get benefits such as parking and such, but also the revenues from your membership support all the programs that we've just talked about. The foundation also has active volunteer programs, including trail maintenance. And this is something that's coming, and it's fitting that we're here, but the foundation and the Park District are working together to at the beginning stages of a capital campaign to restore the Environmental Conservation Center, which is behind us, which will be an exciting program. And it's a little bit lagged once again because of COVID, but it's something that's coming. So we're excited about that. And with that, I just want to thank you all for your support of the foundation. And if those who don't know about it, consider joining, becoming members. Our donations we're always happy to have donations to support great park programs. That there are many, and they all need our support. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Les. Okay, I kind of can't believe I'm introducing this next guy. I guess you guys, there's no program, so maybe you don't know who the next speaker is. So I'm going to start before I say his name and say this is a gentleman who I believe started his 43-year career with East Bay Regional Parks as a 47? Okay, gonna have to update that website. But 47, we'll see how many things I get right versus wrong here, but I believe he started as a park ranger in Black Diamond Mines Historic Preserve, which is an amazing place, and he brought a love of the land. I think he cut his teeth on conservation with Save Mount Diablo. He was a founding member. One thing I think is kind of interesting is I read that he was a founding member of the Bay Area Ridge Trail Council. And if you read the Olmsted Hall report, I think it's amazing that in 1930, it really envisions the Bay Area Ridge Trail. They don't call it the Ridge Trail, but they envision a trail that went all the way around the way they're trying to do today. It's amazing, in 1930. And that's something that the Olmsted people brought to the Olmsted Hall report. Anyway, without going too far afield, the last 10 years, Robert C. Doyle served as the general manager of this agency. To list all his accomplishments, we would be here a long time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Bob Doyle. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the most important thing to me, which is I owe Bob personally. Tina, I'm supposed to introduce Tina? No. I want to say that, I spent 25 years here. I fell in love with the history. I was an interpreter. In 2013, Bob, or probably his people, came to me and said, Bob Doyle is now on the directors or the trustees board for National Association of Olmsted Parks. And hey, Dave Z and Brenda, we want you to become Olmsted experts. Now, I'm not sure we fulfilled that, but Bob sent us out, or along with him, we went to Washington, D.C. for a fall 2013 Olmsted conference. And then in March of 14, they came out here to Stanford. And it was really because of your welcoming me into this history world that I'm here today. So I thank you for that.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Good. Oh, got the main director back there. It is, the sound director. That's great. Good evening, everybody. And this is a beautiful, cool for some people, very cool for everybody. Cool. And I really want to thank you all for coming today. I'm used to being in Tilton, as Dave probably is, when the fog comes rolling over the bay and slams into Tilton Park and drifts into Orinda. So this is a very special night. It really is. So I want to really thank the family for being here. It's truly an honor as a member of originally the board of the National Organization of Olmsted Parks, but on the advisory committee in this wonderful year. It's a fantastic renaissance of the philosophy and dedication to the park movement of the Olmsted family. And it's just all over the United States, restorations of parks that were run down, restoration of some incredible monuments were in those parks. It's happening all over the United States this year. It's really exciting, very, very exciting. I think one of the things for me is after the Jan 6 terrible situation in our country, the Capitol grounds were closed. And one of the things that the Olmsted organization did was really lobby Congress to get public access back to that most incredible landscape in the U.S. Capitol grounds. And I think that's in itself a great accomplishment. Well, everybody knows about Central Park. What would New York be without Central Park? Oh my goodness, it's just hard to even think about it. But I really want to focus on the contribution of the park movement and the philosophy of access and equity and commons, the public commons for people. And so when we talk about over the 100 parks that were done by Olmsted Sr., and then later on with both his son Olmsted Jr. and John Charles Olmsted, his son, complicated history there, but also his son, his stepson. But I think it was really the whole firm's foremost effort when there was not really a park movement to create the entire national park movement in a lot of ways. And so he wrote that it was a fundamental duty of a democratic society to provide healthy, safe places for people in cities. And I think that's just such a democratic American thing that we need to think about today. And so that was one of the things that really excited me. He was not only a designer, which created really landscape architecture. He was the father of landscape architecture. It's hard to imagine that long ago there was no landscape architecture until Olmsted really brought that forward, and his son moved it even further than that. But I think one of the core beliefs was that it is about, and it's so pertinent today, it is about social equity. When Olmsted visited Europe, he went to the great gardens in England and was really inspired by those, but he also realized that so much of the history of space, of open space and parks, was the royalty. It was the wealthy. And he really brought home that it should be available for all people. And I think that's, again, really, really pertinent to the whole movement of parks, before and now. He felt that the enjoyment of scenery employs the mind without fatigue and exercises it So I think today, the awareness that has happened after COVID and people being locked in the house and the division in the United States, to think about safe, healthy places, not just for the body, but for mental health. And I think that's just a critically important thing that has really come forward in the last few years, but not for the Olmsteds, a long, long time ago. Well, I think that when Central Park opened in 1859, a very long time ago, some park designers felt that in modern history, Olmsted's designs were antiquated, and a lot of the parks were falling apart in the 60s and 70s. They weren't being invested in. Parks were not being invested in. And so some of the ornate designs are dated, obviously, that long time ago. So when I started to read more, I soon realized that his deep commitment to social justice and park ideals are even more relevant today than any of the designs of the parks he did. And I take away nothing from the great parks, but the philosophy and ideals of democracy and social justice are so well envisioned by his writings. And a lot of people aren't aware that Olmsted was a writer and a journalist long before he became the designer. And one of the things that really impacted him, besides visiting the English parks in the lands of the wealthy, was going to the South. And he was so outraged by slavery. And he wrote about it, and he wrote journals about it and stories about it. And it really impacted him. Well, right after that, he was employed to really run, after having 1,000 workers creating Golden Gate Park. Think of that workforce at that time, all those jobs at that time, and all that work being done. In Central Park, he really thought about, broader ideas, and I'll talk a lot about that with the movement in the national parks. But when he went south, it really affected him, and it really affected him, the condition of the South and how people were being treated, and how slavery was still such a terrible thing, and the Civil War happened. And he became in charge of running, I think because of the experience of running so many people at Central Park, of running what became the Red Cross. And he was in charge of helping injured soldiers and organizing sanitation at that time. It's an amazing thing. But it really impacted him. It really, I think, got to his soul of the devastation of the Civil War. Well, right at the peak of the Civil War is when Lincoln brought forward the Yosemite and Mariposa Grove Grant in the peak of the Civil War. And part of that was a hope that America would be united again, all the way across to California from the East Coast, that the thought of a democratic place, of places where the public would be healed again in our United States. But he then was hired to run what was the original John C. Fremont gold mine in the Sierra Nevadas, which had been pretty played out, but because again he had experience with the Sanitation Commission, he had experience with running this, he was hired to run that. And it didn't work out real well, but because it basically was played out. I think Fremont took all the money and he took it to Monterey, which is true. And but what he got was the visit to Yosemite. And I truly feel that what is different is being an urban park social justice advocate and writer and philosopher. He saw this grand landscape. And although he's so associated with the built environment, roads and bridges and construction and all those things, he was really, I think it really changed him. And it became some of his thinking of a bigger picture about these incredible natural landscapes in the park movement, which became the National Park Movement. And so he was hired by the California Commission. This was not a national park yet. There were not national parks from the national park side. And so there was Yellowstone, but it was the federal government. It was the cavalry who was running the national parks, hence the hat. And what he really saw there was an opportunity to promote the preservation of America's most iconic places. The good news was he wrote an incredible report, and that report was something that Olmsted Jr. would rely on in helping to create the Organic Act in 1916 for the National Park System. He relied on many of the quotes, things like preservation and enjoyment by the public. They added in the enjoyment part of that, not just preservation of scenery and the incredible beauty, but the enjoyment of the public in these things. And so there was always that natural love of scenery and parks, but also back to social justice, back to in bringing things to people. So I think that's a very important part. And when we think about the evolution of the national parks, you think about John Muir and the advocacy of John Muir and preservation in his writings. But on the other side of that balance, to me, is the writings of the Olmsteds. And it's really critical to kind of the systematic approach of design and how do you make it work? How do you make it happen for people? I think that's pretty great. So one of the key contributions of Olmsted Jr. Was then taking from that part of the national parks, but also he then eventually became the person who put together the first plan, Olmsted Jr., of the state park system. And today, it's really important that we rely on that same philosophy of bringing parks to people and of equity and of justice in our parks. And it is something that every park agency and every park manager is talking about. So when his sons took over that firm, it was an opportunity for Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to really think about California. And one of the things that really I thought was special was he wanted to preserve these iconic state park areas, the Redwoods, Lake Tahoe, Mount Diablo. All those were a part of that plan. But he also, like his father, thought about the people aspect. So Southern California was park heavy on proposals for beaches, for access for those populations. So the balance of the scenic preservation of these iconic, natural, beautiful places in California, some of them very remote, was balanced by really big emphasis on where people live, especially in Southern California. That's why you have all those beaches in Southern California that are state parks. So one of the contributions of Olmsted Jr. was really the Redwoods Parks, and he became a part of Save the Redwoods League. And I really want to talk about my introduction of the president and CEO of the Save the Redwoods League. 100 years plus of incredible conservation history. But today, that leadership under Sam Hodder's guidance is really focused on partnerships with Native American people, what they're doing with up in Northern California with tribal leadership, what they're doing with the national park and the state parks to create a whole new restoration of Prairie Creek and a visitor center up there, what they're doing in communities with partnerships like with the East Bay Regional Park District and other places to promote whole access of underserved communities. So those partnerships continue today. They are under the key leadership of Sam, his board of counselors, and of the membership and staff at Save the Redwoods League. So it is my pleasure to introduce what I consider a visionary in today's parks who believe in partnerships and the restoration of spirit as well as redwood forest, still providing key acquisitions in the Sierras of Sierra Redwood as well as the coast, but really being in the leadership role of restoration of second growth forests and the real effort to bring youth into science jobs, and the opportunity for young people to learn science and to focus on climate change. And I think that's a great advancement of the League and of the work they have done for over 100 years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sam Hodder, President and CEO of Save the Redwoods League.
Thanks so much, Bob. He still got it, huh? Brush off those oratory chops. Right back. Thank you so much. I'm really, really glad to be here. I'm the pretty picture component of your program once we get this up and running, so give us a minute while we get some slides. But I'm really excited to be here to help celebrate the remarkable contribution of the Olmsted family to the world of parks and landscape architecture. I recently was back in Washington, D.C., where I was doing a similar presentation at a celebration there on the Capitol grounds. It was just remarkable to be there with colleagues of all of ours, conservation and park leaders from around the country there to celebrate this incredible legacy. Hello, I'm Sam Hodder, President and CEO of Save the Redwoods League, and I'm so glad to be here in celebration of the Olmsted legacy. I'm going to share a little bit today about how that Olmsted legacy is rooted in the mighty redwood forests of California. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Yeah. All right. How Olmsted's connection to the effort to save the redwoods and the East Bay Hills helped to launch the land conservation movement in this country, and in my view, positioned us collectively to lead again in a new era of urgency. At a time where our shared natural spaces play an unprecedented role in our resilience in the face of a rapidly changing world, we would do well to ask ourselves, what would the Olmsteds do today? As we all know well, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and Jr. were visionaries who saw parks as elemental to American society, part of the fabric of modern life that reflected a purely American sense of place. Like schools, churches, and museums, parks were critical elements to the infrastructure of a healthy and vibrant community. And the power and beauty of nature that took center stage in Olmsted's parks was critical to our health and well-being. A core element of their philosophy was to make the beauty of nature a part of all of our lives. They believed that it was the American way, that our most beautiful landscapes, as Bob was saying, were not just for the landed gentry and the landowning class, but rather should be set aside for all of us, the physical manifestation of our right to the pursuit of happiness. I personally am lucky enough to have lived in Olmsted-designed landscapes my whole life, as many of us are. My childhood neighborhood in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Acadia National Park in my grandmother's hometown in Bar Harbor, Maine, the emerald necklace of parks around Portland, Maine, where I did conservation work for many years, and of course, as a resident here in the East Bay Regional Park District landscape. Olmsted's hand was behind all of it. And when I moved to California to work in land conservation, where the modern conservation movement was born, I learned once again that the park system and the ready access to beauty and of nature that so defines the ethos of the Golden State was all Olmsted all over again. Most significantly, Olmsted Jr., or most significantly for my remarks today, Olmsted Jr. was instrumental in the creation of the California park system, as Bob was saying. Oh, excuse me, went too fast. He was commissioned by Save the Redwoods League, actually, in 1928, to develop a master plan for California state park system. The park plan recommended the acquisition and dedication of 125 parks throughout the state of California. And shockingly, virtually all of them came into existence within just a few years. Think of that today. Imagining designing a plan to acquire 125 new parks and having it actually happen, and quickly. I mean, that's really incredible when you put your mind to it. And as if that weren't enough to demonstrate Olmsted's ability to catalyze or harness community support for conservation and translate that support into transformational investment. As we all know well, just a decade later, he was hired again by many of those same Bay Area leaders who established Save the Redwoods League to design a park system for the East Bay. And to advance that plan, the residents of the East Bay, in the middle of the Great Depression, voted to tax themselves. Of course, this is a story we all know so well. Voted to tax themselves in order to create new parks. and launched the largest regional park system in the country that to this day is the gold standard of regional park systems. Thinking about what we are all going through these days, I think we could use a little bit more Olmsted today. We need the rejuvenative community building power of parks now more than ever. If we have learned anything from this pandemic, it's that we need the healing power of nature in our lives. And if there is anything we have learned from the changing climate and its impact on our communities, it's that we need more spaces where nature holds sway. When Olmsted began his epic state parks plan, there were around 5 million people in California. Now there are around 40 million and growing. And it has been almost 15 years since California State Parks has acquired new lands, let alone created a new park. In contrast to the substantial public investment in parks and open space of the Olmsted era, when Olmsted and the League, together with our partners, inspired the creation of an entire park system from whole cloth in a matter of a few years, today funding for California State Parks is less than 1/4% of the overall state budget. We are due for an Olmsted moment. So, as we think about how Olmsted inspired the transformation of our nation's relationship with nature and public spaces, and think about that transformation in the context of the current challenges we face today, in the face of the existential threat of climate change, a global pandemic, and a movement to reimagine inclusive and equitable parks and public lands, what would Olmsted Jr. do today? So to work towards that answer, I'm going to start with what I know best, of course, the Redwoods. We're going to talk about big trees. Olmsted Jr.'s philosophy has been infused into the mission of Save the Redwoods League ever since he joined the League's Board of Counselors in 1926, and he remained on that council for the next 29 years. He sought to immerse visitors in restorative and therapeutic natural landscapes, an experience he viewed as the most profound and effective antidote to the stresses of urban life. In developing the plans for the California State Park System, he drew inspiration from the Redwoods for good reason. And we've all been lucky enough to spend time in the Redwoods, and we know to be in the presence of trees so massive and ancient inspires a sense of resilience and a sense of community. But that vote for conservation here in the East Bay in the midst of the worst economic crisis wasn't the first time an Olmsted inspired conservation investment in a time of urgent crisis, as was served as a means of bringing us together around our shared need for the beauty of nature. Bob told the story earlier that in 1864, inspired by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and the giant sequoia of the Mariposa Grove, President Lincoln took the first great step of land conservation. In the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln set aside the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias in Yosemite Valley as publicly protected land, the first time in American history when wild nature was protected for public enjoyment. This was a watershed moment in the development of a land conservation movement in America. And the Sierra Redwoods and the Olmsted family were right there at the starting line. In the early 20th century, Save the Redwoods League was founded to protect the remaining old growth. When we were started, environmentalism didn't even exist. There was no Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The League was writing the rules of the game as we went. We created the tools of conservation and put them into practice, and the community has been using them ever since. Indeed, there was not even a structured public agency with whom to partner in the long-term stewardship of the Redwood Parks that the Olmsted Plan encouraged us to protect. So in 1927, the year after Olmsted Jr. joined the League's council, the League initiated and led the legislative effort to create the California State Park System to own and manage the redwood forest that the League and our partners were working to protect. Then in 1928, the League launched what at the time was the biggest publicity campaign in California history to promote a parks bond. The California State Parks Bond Act was the state's first ever parks bond and one of the first of its kind in the country. It passed in every county and by a margin of nearly 3-1. It was the funding program that launched the acquisition of land for California's state park system. That same year, the League recruited Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. to create a master plan, a vision for the parks in the state park system. And in 1928, identified 125 sites, as I mentioned, and those state parks are today core, or the Redwood Parks were core to that system. And so the League got to work protecting those forests acre by acre. Humboldt Redwoods State Park, Prairie Creek, Del Norte Redwoods, Jedediah Smith State Park were all identified in the plan as critical opportunities to protect the last of the ancient forests. Today, those state parks contain more than 40% of the world's remaining old-growth redwoods and are at the heart and soul of a network of redwood parks that welcome more than 31 million visitors a year. Now, a century after Save the Redwoods League began, we remain focused on protecting the redwood forests. The initial objective was to protect what were deemed representative stands of the ancient redwood forest before they were all lost. Today, with the devastation and clear cut of the forests around those protected groves, they are just that, representative stands, like museum exhibits of what the forest used to be. We know now that that's not enough. A grove does not a forest make, and we need healthy, resilient forest ecosystems to sustain our world. And to further compel a more expansive conservation vision, in recent years we have learned that old-growth redwood forests sequester more carbon per acre than any other forest on the planet, by a long shot. The second-place finisher isn't anywhere close. One of the parks in Olmsted's plan, Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park up by the Oregon border, contains more above-ground biomass per acre than anywhere on the planet. More leaf surface area, more epiphytic life, that stuff that grows on other living things, the ferns, huckleberry bushes that grow in the crown and canopy of the redwood forest. We found a mature Doug fir tree growing in the canopy of a 2,000-year-old redwood tree. There is more carbon sequestered. There was one tree up in that park that puts on a metric ton of wood in a single year. Just one tree, a metric ton of wood. At a time when we are struggling to mitigate the proliferation of carbon in the atmosphere in order to save the planet, it's worth paying attention to these little pieces of data. I would wager that Olmsted would suggest we incorporate some of that information into our investment choices. That in a time of climate change, we need to expand our park vision to a landscape scale vision, protecting and restoring the sea of young redwood forests that surround the islands of old growth, and healing the forest to be the old growth of the future. So that's what we're doing. For example, and thank you, Bob, for mentioning it. For example, after acquiring the Del Norte and Jed Smith Redwood State Parks in the 1930s, based on the Olmsted's plan, in 2002, Save the Redwoods League acquired 23,000-acre Mill Creek watershed that links those two parks together. It was a sea of former clear cuts entangled with logging roads that links together Jed Smith and Del Norte Redwoods. We added this young recovering forest to Redwood National and State Parks, and we are currently actively managing it, removing miles and miles of abandoned logging roads, thinning overly dense stands to encourage the growth of mature redwoods, hiring Yurok tribal crews to help restore riparian areas to bring the salmon back to the streams. Olmsted believed in nature's hand in guiding the aesthetics of parks, light touch landscape architecture, scenic vistas of untrammeled nature. But today we know that these landscapes have suffered. That now, because of the devastation of impact of timber harvest, active stewardship is critical to healing these natural places. So with what we have learned about climate and carbon sequestration and biodiversity in the redwoods, Olmsted would no doubt have expanded his vision for why we need to save these critical forests and how we expand our vision from representative stands to landscape scale conservation and restoration. I would also wager that in addition to his evolution in the thought of why and how, he would also fully support our collective evolution in for whom we are saving these special places. For all of our debt to the early founders of the conservation movement, we know now that many in our community were excluded from the process. Indeed, the roots of Save the Redwoods League are tangled with the leadership of the eugenics movement of the early 1900s and the exclusion of marginalized communities from early conservation. And in California and in many parts of the West, while land was being distributed for industry and agriculture and parkland, tribes were being forcibly removed from the places that were fundamental to their identities, cultures, and histories. In California, tribes were systematically eradicated through government-sponsored genocide and in the years preceding and following California statehood. Today, indigenous peoples continue to restore their relationships with their ancestral lands and their stewardship traditions, and the League and our partners are working hard to support that restoration, seeking opportunities for co-management, tribal acquisition of culturally significant conservation lands, and traditional stewardship and cultural access. And most fundamentally, in alignment with the Olmsted vision, knowing that our parks are overrun and often inaccessible to many, we need to accelerate the pace and scale of our conservation work in creating new parks that connect all of us to the beauty and power of nature.
Thank you, Bob.
But we know that it isn't just about buying the land, especially when so much of the land we are working to protect has already suffered from years of extraction and intense management. We have had to expand on the Olmsted vision of protecting land and parks to include active management and restoration. In recent years, Save the Redwoods League, in partnership with National Park Service and California State Parks, all three of us, with Olmsted in our DNA, I would add, have launched the most ambitious restoration project in the Redwood Forest. It's known as Redwoods Rising. In the northernmost part of the parks of the Redwood Range, where the trees grow taller than anywhere in the world, we are actively restoring the former clear-cut forests that surround the old-growth groves of Olmsted's 95-year-old plan, accelerating the healing of the young redwood forest on its path to be the old growth of the future. And there is similar work to do right here in Reinhardt Redwood Regional Park, for example. We were strong supporters of the voter-approved funding measure that brought dollars to those restoration plans and remain eager to find ways to bring our science and stewardship capacity to bear in the help of implementing those restoration plans here in the East Bay Regional Park District. Save the Redwoods League created a Redwood Park system in partnership with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and subsequently here in the East Bay, both for the sake of the forest and because parks make our lives better, our communities stronger, and our families healthier. Today, California is home to 40 million people with a level of cultural and ethnic diversity never considered when our park system was first created. Olmsted and his fellow counselors at Save the Redwoods League and here at East Bay Regional Park District believe deeply that parks, particularly our redwood parks, were fundamental to healthy communities. Today, we collectively are advancing that fundamental belief to its full implementation. We are bringing voices and communities that were excluded in past eras to the table to lead in the conservation of our parks and special places, to ensure that redwood parks feel inclusive and welcoming to all of us. In conclusion, the more we think about the legacy of Olmsted and the relevance of his core philosophy to the challenges we are facing today, the more clear it is that we need another Olmsted era. We need to inspire another unprecedented level of investment in nature-based solutions to climate change through landscape-scale conservation and active restoration management. In so doing, we have the opportunity to restore the roots that link us together and build back the natural resilience of our landscapes. Our world has changed so much so fast. As we climb out of these intense years of health crisis, economic crisis, cultural and political crisis, and climate and wildfire crisis, and we wrestle with the world that we hope to create in the place of the old one, we would be wise to remember how Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. clearly saw the power of these forests to inspire healthier lives and a love of nature. We are deeply proud of how Olmsted set in motion our conservation vision 100 years ago, and how the parks inspired in the East Bay have improved the lives of generations of residents. Today, we take that philosophy that centers the power and resilience of nature and its connection to all of us as we look to accelerate the pace and scale of the work that he helped us to start. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sam Hodder. That was great. Here's what I suggest. We're gonna plug in one more laptop. We're gonna show you some more pretty pictures. If you feel like taking a stretch break or doing some jumping jacks because you're kind of cold, go ahead and do that, but give us about 15 seconds.
I'm just gonna stand up.
After I read colder over and over again, it's going to be cold over there. You got your sweater? Yes. Didn't bring it. Yes. We were waiting for it to bring it. Oh, got it. Yes.
All right, folks, you have heard a lot about Olmsted, Junior, Senior, Save the Redwoods, and I think what I'm going to do in the time that I was asked to present is I want to, sorry. There we go. Technology. Okay, so as you can see, when I sort of thought about what I want to say or what I could say is really what is tracing the Olmsted roots. East Bay Regional Parks. To what debt do we really owe to Junior, Senior, to the firm? And it's a little hard to sort out because, to be honest, some of the direct connection is a bit fleeting. And so what I did is focus a little bit on each of them. And as Bob started his program with, I don't know if you can read that, but I'm focusing more with Olmsted Sr. on some of the big ideas and principles. And those are really the ideas that we're indebted to today and that still live on, in my opinion. And these have been summarized. These are more my words, but parks are key institutions of a liberal democracy, that there's almost a moral function to scenery. You hear a lot said about scenery. That's how they describe these beautiful places that we're in. Scenery and landscape design. We'll see some quotes. And then, as been talked about, the Yosemite report really lays the intellectual foundation, the philosophical base for the National Park Service in 1916. This is just my take, the Dave Z take on the Olmsteds, which is really, if you can't read it, it says Senior's influence on the son. So in what ways do we see Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., what ways do we see his ideas reflected in the work of the son? The Organic Act, which was the 1916 Park Service Act, and then of course the Olmsted Hall report that's been touched on numerous times. So let's jump in with Senior. And you know, everyone probably thinks of Central Park right away, right? Frederick Law Olmsted, Central Park. Well, I wanted to go just a wee bit backwards, and Bob Doyle touched on this as well, but I find it fascinating that he actually was paid by the New York Daily Times to take a sojourn through the South, and he went all the way down to Florida, around, came back, then did another trip over to Texas, and he sent back these dispatches which were published by the Times, and then later he published these books that were finally collected in a trilogy and published in England in 1860 called The Cotton Kingdom. And he went there really, I think his primary intent was to study slave labor and free labor. And this map, what it's kind of showing is the production, cotton production. And if you could see the lines, it's showing which regions had free labor, which had slave labor, and that kind of thing. And what his conclusion was that actually free labor was a lot more productive than slave labor. But he came away with sort of developing this views that slavery was wrong and that a lot of the justifications at the time were really not right. And that kind of, he grew with his anti-slavery opinions as time went on. But going back to Central Park, this was the award-winning design that he and his partner, Calbert Vox, submitted, the Greensward Plan. I won't go into all the details, but again, this idea that this was happening leading up to the Civil War, and democracy is a word you hear a lot. So he, egalitarian, equality, democracy, he says here, it is of great importance. He's looking back later. It is of great importance as the first real park made in this country. And it was a democratic development of the highest order. And, there's a lot you could say about it. I'm not going to talk about his landscape architecture principles, but as a park guy, I think it's interesting, for two reasons. One, here he anticipates population growth. And he did do interesting things, like sunk a lot of the streets that would traverse the park at lower grades so that the traffic wouldn't be a hindrance. But he also foresaw the need for keepers of the park and police. Civil War has been mentioned, but he had a horrible carriage accident near Central Park, I think, where he was thrown and his wife was dragged, and she was okay, but he suffered a lame leg, and so he couldn't actually serve in the military the way he would have liked, but he ended up taking a position leading the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was a private relief organization. And he worked there for a couple years, but he just really overworked himself and could not take the politics. And so he got a better offer, I guess you could say, and he headed to California. And this is pretty fascinating, I think. He was a careful guy, he was well-connected, and it was a happenstance thing. He ran into someone and said, hey, they're looking for a superintendent at the Mariposa Estate, which was the largest gold mine in California at the time. And he did his due diligence. The mine had been actually owned by John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder explorer that we know about. He had bought this thing and then sold it. And the investors in New York were like, this is great, we're making money hand over fist. So he hops on a couple of boats, takes the train across the Isthmus of Panama, steams up to San Francisco, comes in here through the Golden Gate, and writes a letter back home a day or two later. And this is just a little part that intrigues me, because along the way, this is an Eastern guy. He comes out to California and it's like, wow, this is different out here. It's dry. And here he's saying this is perfectly bare. He's talking about the hills coming through the Golden Gate are perfectly bare of trees or shrubs and almost awfully bleak. So that's his first description. And then wait till he gets up to the foothills of the Sierra, Mariposa County. This is near Mariposa. It's a little town called Bear Valley. And this is where the Mariposa mine headquarters was. And there's a little hotel. He lived across the street above a shop. And after about 6 months, his wife comes out with a private school teacher, a servant, and their 4 kids. And by the way, one of those 4 kids was not Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. because he wasn't born in 1864. He was born in 1870. But there were still 4 kids. 3 were from, that's a long story. But 3 were stepchildren of his. And we've talked about John Charles, and this is a horrible picture, but he's the second from the left, and he went on to practice landscape architecture as well. Just a word about this mining. I guess I'm a history nut, especially old California. These are beautiful Carlton Watkins photographs, all from that era. Almost every black and white photo is either 1860s, 1870s. Carlton Watkins, so contemporaneous. And I wish I had a pointer here, but the left, this is the mountainous country, and they're not using a gold pan. They are tunneling, following quartz veins, building shafts, and hauling out ore and crushing it in these mills, these giant stamp mills. That's what they're doing. He walks down every shaft, explores it all, and actually starts to get worried because it just doesn't seem like a very well-run place. I want to make a comment about this, which is this sort of two things on this slide. It's a classic Gold Rush California image. But here's the thing. One, it's kind of showing you the original kind of gold discovery type of mining called placer mining with the pan and the long tom and the sluice spots. But two, this actually has some Chinese workers. And Olmsted talks about what he really calls the uncivilized, wild, barbarous country. And he's horrified. He writes back one week in a letter, there were robberies this week, 6 hangings, and several people were shot. And here he says, he's talking about white people. He says, people here have been almost completely emancipated from the operation of the ordinary laws by which civilized life is maintained. I mean, it just wasn't, but he had a positive outlook. He saw himself as going to improve this place. Here he talks about the Chinese, and he was struck by how industrious they were, and in fact employed a lot of Chinese in his mines. He said, if the Chinese have ever learned anything of white men except new forms of vice and wickedness, I can't think by what means it has been. So while he's there, he's got these grand plans of bringing in a water canal from the South Fork of the Merced River. The place is dry as a bone, and it's just really going to be hard to make it work. His investors, his owners never let him go forward on this. It's one reason he becomes disillusioned. But he takes a trip in the fall of 1863, a side trip when he's scouting for water, and he goes not into the valley, but over to the Mariposa Grove. He meets the so-called guardian of Yosemite, Galen Clark, and he sees these giant trees. And he writes his wife a few days later, and there was mail back and forth. Took a couple months, but that's what they did. I had a highly interesting journey in the mountains. We passed through the Big Tree Grove. The trees, don't strike you as monsters at all, but simply as the grandest tall trees you ever saw. You feel that they are distinguished strangers who have come down to us from another world. So this is the beginning of his rapture with this landscape up here in the mountains, and it's really quite a counterpoint to the way he describes the East Bay, I think. So the family comes out. They actually have a pretty good time. Kids riding donkeys, studying rocks and plants with Miss Arrington, the school teacher. And they make their first trip. They do a vacation in the summer of '64. And they don't know at this point that Lincoln has actually signed, or we don't think they know that Lincoln has signed this epic bill. And so at this time, Yosemite had been getting publicized for about 10 years through art and journals and photographs. And this would be the view that they would have seen of the valley for the first time coming in from Mariposa on the Mariposa Trail. This is, again, a Carlton Watkins photograph. And he says, this is actually lifted from his famous Yosemite report. I can't remember if someone already read this, but there's so much you could say, and I think I'm going to read this, but what he's saying, well, let me read it. The Union, and this is Olmsted, reading junior and senior, I got to say, it's articulate, it's deep, it's scholarly, and it's hard. And it's hard to wrap my mouth around it sometimes. Long sentences, but very impactful. He says, the union of deepest sublimity with the deepest beauty of nature, not in any landscape that can be framed by itself, but all around and wherever the visitor goes, constitute the Yosemite, the greatest glory of nature. And I think what he says, or I think what he means if you read it, is that it's an amazing place, but there's probably better waterfalls in the world. Maybe there's a better meadow. Maybe there's a more beautiful creek. But if you put it all together, it kind of blows your mind. And not only that, it actually works on your mind and your well-being, as we'll see in a minute. So again, that summer, he doesn't really know this is going on quite yet, but there had been a movement to preserve these lands. They were already being impacted by private individuals setting up hotels and grazing and this and that. And so Lincoln signs this act in June 30th, 1864, and they set aside. So here's the thing, most of you probably know this, but Yosemite National Park today is national. It was a national park, but they gave it to California to run. Public use, resort, recreation, inalienable for all time. This was unprecedented in the country, setting aside land for this purpose, for people to enjoy, not allowing private investors, not allowing concessionaire, well, maybe concession later, but not allowing private use. Without getting too much in the details, I got this from a new book called Yosemite, Olmsted and Yosemite by Ethan Carr and Rolf Diamant, and they talk a lot about the context. And the context really is the Civil War, but in 1862 and around then, there's all these acts, and these are unprecedented as well. Homestead Act, the Railroad Act, the Land Grant College Act, and so you can sort of see this land grant of public land as sort of part of this government sort of enactment of the Republican vision for a union, for a more perfect union, for equality. So this is sort of the context for these ideas and the environment that Sr. was practicing under. Well, he does get back, he finally gets some news, and he finds out, hey, the governor of California has just appointed me to be the head of a state park commission to take care of this place. Takes it very seriously, even though his time at the mine is winding down. He's sort of waiting to find out when the thing's going to fold. The sheriff shows up and is about to shut him down. He talks him out of it, and he writes this report. He pays out of his own pocket for some guys to go survey the lands before the snows come in. And this is a huge report. But here is probably the piece that you often see. It is the main duty of government, if it is not the sole duty, to provide means of protection for all its citizens in the pursuit of happiness against the obstacles which the selfishness of individuals is liable to interpose to that pursuit. So that's a mouthful, but it's saying we the people have a right to enjoy this land, and you don't have a right just to make money off of it. So, as I said, it's the base for the state national parks. He talks about, hey, there's about a couple hundred people a year, but this is going to go up to thousands and millions, and he foresees the fact that we need to protect this place. And then this, I was really struck by this because he goes on and really goes deep into this. He's extolling the regenerative power of nature. And I think of, I think Mona Coe is here tonight, and from Public Affairs, I think of healthy parks, healthy people. That's a campaign we celebrate today. This goes back way long ago. Here he talks about, if you read the thing, it says operation of scenes of beauty on the mind. That the scenes of beauty operate on our mind. It leads to a reinvigoration that is favorable to health and vigor of men. And it's not just for an upper class, it's for all people. And maybe some people need to be taught to appreciate this environment, but they can learn. So I guess I better speed up here since we're still on Senior, but he comes down, he's got to make a little money. And so he comes down to the Bay Area intermittently here and there, and he gets some jobs. And he the only one, sort of what I find interesting about this field is you make all kinds of plans for different kinds of clients, and only some of them really actually get enacted. A lot of times they don't, or only part of them does. In this case, of these three plans, only Mountain View Cemetery was done according to his plan. And by the way, there's a tour there tomorrow. You can talk to Brenda Montano about that. But I am intrigued by the College of California plan. And so a lot of people will say, well, it was the UC Berkeley plan, but it wasn't UC Berkeley because UC Berkeley came around in 1868. It was the College of California at Oakland plan, and they wanted to move to Berkeley, and they hired this guy to check it out. And so he did. And the first time he went there was in March of '65. He writes to Mary, his wife, "I had a hard day's work with Miller yesterday, riding over the hills of college property under very heavy squalls of rain and snow, and I'm very stiff from it." What got me from that, of being a Berkeley boy, is like it was snowing in March. It's like, wow, that's pretty cool. And then to his partner, Calvert Fox, back in New York, who's the whole time trying to say, "Buddy, come on back, we need you back here." He said, "This is an accursed country with no trees and no turf, and it's a hard job to make sure of any beauty." But I think what's important to keep in mind that it is in California that he sort of figures out a way to, quote, treat the semi-arid West, that you don't just try and make it look like the East. So this is a little confusing because this is showing Berkeley in 1874. So it's the only picture I could find. So you see the two big halls of the university. But he drew this map, or one map's lost, one map is found. And this map was the layout of sort of a park-like campus with residential areas and big homes around it. That was his plan. If you look at the map, you see this is where he wanted to put the university. It ended up being a little bit lower in his plan than North and South Hall. His biographer in the footnotes say it's right around the Moffitt Undergrad Library, if you know campus. And so just a couple of points of that plan, and then I want to get into one of my little tiny pet projects, but they called it the campus park, and I think as a counterpoint to that sort of uncivilized land that he lived in, he decided that college students needed to be surrounded by families in fine homes and not have dormitories and big halls, but to live in group homes. So I don't know if he envisioned what a fraternity home would be like, but that's what he said. Good roads and walks that pass pleasant scenes and fine views. Again, screening the coarse, rude, raw landscape with trees and shrubs and vines. And he did call for turf for lawn, but very minimal. And he talked a lot about the neighborhood planting, and he talked about the foreground and the midground and the distant view and the pleasure drive. So you see the one going to the right was the road that he envisioned, a private road, not private, but separate from commercial traffic, a pleasure drive for carriages to go at the base of the Berkeley Oakland Hills to probably over to Mountain View Cemetery. Now on the top you see where this little creek comes in. Whoops, sorry about that. I have to go through all those little animations again. Can't speed it up. So this was something I got intrigued with, so I hope you'll bear with me on this next slide. I want to actually thank Gray Brecken for musing with me on this and indulging me. And so here's the thing. I think it's become very common, and I've been guilty of this, and I don't mean to detract from the great debt we all owe to Olmsted Sr., but we often like to say, the vision for East Bay Parks began with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. He envisioned scenic lanes and parks in the hills, and I was like, okay, this is gonna be great. I'm gonna read this, I'm gonna read everything in the East Bay, and I'm gonna find it, and it's gonna be cool. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it. I think and if there's some scholar here that wants to talk to me after, hey, that's how we learn. But he talks about Strawberry Canyon, and he says in this report, this is where I think this comes from. It says there should be convenient stopping places for carriages on the tableland, from which a walk should be formed to the highest point of the knoll around which the lane passes. I've read that so many times, and I'm like, wow. This road goes all the way to the top of the Berkeley Hills, got a great view, parks, it's gonna be good. Well, it is gonna be good, but I don't think that's what he had in mind. Here's an example of the kind of, this is a newspaper article, but there's authors that go, everyone kind of talks about this. This one says our regional park system was first planned in '66, but the article has no proof or anything. So I read a little bit more, and there's a clue. It says one of the neighborhood lanes extends eastwardly to the mouth of the gorge in the mountains, to the point where the branch enters from the left, to reach the small tableland. So, okay, I read that 3-4 times. What is a branch? Well, I think what he's talking about is the branches of Strawberry Creek. The campus was laid out on between the two lower branches. But we already know that was the campus. So if you go a little higher up, I'll show you what you find. And another clue, it says at this point, there's a very interesting view through the gorge and out upon the bay. And so here is a picture from 1930 from what I think is actually the tableland, which is the CCC camp that was in Strawberry Canyon, 33, 4 maybe. And sure, it's been graded, but I took myself to the Earth Sciences Library at UC Berkeley, and Heiko was in the audience. He very kindly, I emailed, and he pulled out all these amazing maps for me. This is 1900 Berkeley Hills contour map. I wanted to get something before Cal Stadium was built so we could see, and I don't have my pointer. Whoa. Anyway, you got Strawberry Creek, you've got the branch on the left, and I think you got the tableland. And furthermore, he talks about the tableland. There's a grazer's house up there. And so if you enlarge on this, you can see on the right, could be the grazer's house. It says Such's Ranch, and you can see where it says creek and the first little branch. So that's what I think Frederick Law Olmsted had in mind. Does it matter? I don't know, but I had fun doing it. All right, I'm better zip through this stuff. So we're going to talk just what I found interesting again was the father's influence on the son. And so a piece of trivia, I don't know if most people know this, but I didn't know this. There's a new book, great biography by Elizabeth Hope Cushing, and I know she got a lot of input from the family and photos and stories. But when Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was born, he was actually named Henry Perkins Olmsted after his mother's father. And it wasn't until he was about 4 years old that they changed the name. And why? I think that they wanted to endow him maybe with the honor, maybe the responsibility, with the legacy, so he really could practice landscape architecture. And he benefited from his father's tutelage and kind of hooked him up. He apprenticed at the World's Fair in Chicago. He graduated Harvard, eventually establishes the country's first program in landscape architecture, and he teaches in it. He works on the famous Biltmore Estate with his father, probably one of his father's, not last, but, sort of near last projects. And finally, think he's not very old. I think he's, I guess he's a little older. No, what is that? Got to do math. 25 years old, he becomes a partner in his father's firm. This is really just to honor the family. The photo on the right came from Sarah, I believe. I'm not going to try and name everybody, but this from Mary. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I can't see my cheat sheet on you guys because it's dark. So, but check. This is their mother. The three sisters here, their mother Charlotte on the left with their father in 1914. I think probably at Biltmore, maybe?
No, it's in Palo Alto.
That's in Palo Alto.
That's at Fairstead.
At Fairstead in Massachusetts, yeah. So I guess the right, thank you, is Palo Alto.
Oh, that's what I thought you said.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so, this is just the part where I want to say that some people say, wow, that Yosemite report wasn't acted upon. It was actually kind of horrible politics. They buried it for some reasons. But Ethan Carr in his book talks about, hey, Olmsted actually, Jr. used that report. He used it in something he wrote in the fight against Hetchy. I'm not going to read it. It's reflected in this Organic Act. So he helped design the bill. But he also is the guy who raised his hand and said, hey, we need to have something that sort of governs this whole thing. Like, why are we doing this? Let's just spell out how it works. And he wrote it. And he talked them into using it. And it says to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner as will leave them unimpaired for future generations. Now here I think Sam Hodder kind of went into a lot of the California stuff, so I'm going to zip through this as well. But I think the picture of the cars reminds me that Olmsted's life spanned quite an epic period in the country's history. We really went from agricultural to more urban, from rural to modern. And that's when urban sprawl, the cars, roads, he talks about roads and byways and pleasure drives. His father's pleasure drive was by horse and buggy, right? Olmsted Jr.'s pleasure drive was by a car. And he talks about the need, so we think of him as a great landscape architect, but he was also a great city planner, and city planning must forecast future conditions. Sam said he joined the councilors in 26. The biography says 19, so I have to figure that one out. But suffice it to say, he had his hand in all kinds of projects in California. I think the thing to say here, because it's been said, is he was instrumental in founding the California State Parks. This is a story I think is worth repeating, is I think that your mother, Charlotte, tell me if this is true, I read this in the biography, she had just got her driver's license, and I don't know, my kid was 16, but she was 14, apparently. And pardon? It was legal then. Okay, that's good. I'm not sure the statute of limitations on that. But, so they had to drive. He drove personally and explored most of California with his wife, and who was at the wheel but Charlotte, driving these mountain roads. I mean, it's just incredible. She's driving her father, and she said they just say like, hey, after that, no driving, no road ever fazed me. So, my understanding is he was a bit tuckered out after that, and so he had to take a break. And so, unfortunately, when we asked him to take part in our survey and plan, he actually sent his chief California deputy, George Gibbs. I hope Jerry Kent is still, Jerry, I put this in for you, buddy. There's an important point, and there's so much history, but just to say on the right that in the very same year that the Olmsted Hall report was produced for us, the company produced a report here that you can see, parks, playgrounds, and beaches for LA. And so then it becomes an interesting study. Why did we hit the grand slam? Almost everything that was envisioned was achieved, and here the report was literally put in the trash bin. Why? It's interesting. I'm not going to go into it all except to say a couple of key things that happened here. I will say that it was mainly the Chamber of Commerce that asked for that report, and when they read the grand scope and the vision that he had and the governing bodies, I think they felt like it had gotten away from them and it wasn't in their own economic interest. So that was sad, to say the least. But here, there was a unique opportunity. The city was creeping up, but the lands were still pristine. And that's because these lands had been owned by a series of water companies, and by the late 20s, they had all sort of coalesced into a company called East Bay Water, and then a new company, public company called East Bay Mud, which exists today, took over mainly with the idea of bringing in Sierra Nevada water, and they did that. And right around the time that they did that, right actually before the time that they were done with Pardee Reservoir, Ansel Hall, his grandchildren are here today, lived in Berkeley, had an office at Cal, sort of took it upon himself to roam all these East Bay hills, put together a preliminary report for a, quote, recreation forest, and kind of laid out what the planning should be, and began working with a bunch of guys at UC Berkeley to come up with a plan, a way to save the hills. Because East Bay Mud, once they had that Sierra water, didn't need most of this East Bay land, because it was considered surplus, because we didn't need local hardly any local watershed projects. And then begins a dialogue, which I suppose today would be done by email, but here was by mail and telegram. And it basically says, Duncan McDuffie writing to Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., hey, we have this thing going on, can you come out here? And he writes back, and he says, well, I can't, but George Gibbs can. And then I like this one. It's where they kind of press him and they say, well, if you can't personally do it, can you at least review it? And can you please put your signature on it? And he said, this little telegram is, yes, we'll do that. I think it's my own little pet peeve about typos, but even in the letter that is sent, I forget, I don't have it right here, but they misspell Olmsted is misspelled so often. I don't know if it bugs you guys as much as it bugs me. I mean, even in the last presentation, it was misspelled. So, and by the way, if you look at our relief model in there, you will see the Olmsted name is misspelled on that. But before you complain, this was a challenge we had when we restored this. And I talked to Gray and others. There's actually 2 errors on that map, but they're historical errors. The way it was produced, it said 2 things that I think were wrong. One, they say Ansel F. Hall and Frederick Law Olmsted, and they misspell Olmsted. And then they say this was prepared by the Citizens Conservation Corps. And I remember asking Gray, and like, hey, what was the Citizens? And there's like, hey, you know what? I think they meant Civilian Conservation Corps. So I don't know. Does it matter? I think it's kind of a big error. Anyway, they produced this map, and this is sort of what our relief model was based off of, where they identified the lower green was the lands that they thought were suitable for parks and recreation. And they wrote this amazing report. There's a lot of city planning, a lot of legwork, checking out all the canyons and lakes and ridges and ridge tops and peaks. And they say, rarely if ever have other communities had the unusual situation that now confronts the East Bay District. And I think, why is that? I think partly it's because all this land was dumped out for sale or on the verge of being dumped out. And where else, he says, where else could this ever happen, and where could you get such a great deal? He probably didn't know quite how stubborn the George Pardee, the head of East Bay Mud, was, but they did work it out finally. Opportunities for enjoyment of outdoor life are doomed with the increase in population at the very time the need will be most urgent. You read it, I mentioned, it envisions the Bay Trail or the Ridge Trail. They talk about a governing board, an executive officer, the need for land use planning so things are not done willy-nilly, and a big thing on fire protection, recognizing how important that is. Well, there was a campaign, a vote, in the midst of the Depression, people voted to pass to create a park district. A couple years later, we got our first 3 original parks. Tilton was one, had a great party over in Redwood Bowl, and I just put this in to show you a bigger picture of the map, and this to me is part of this whole vision achieved deal. So if you look at the green here, and then you look at the green there, like that's a home run. That's like there's a couple of things you could quibble about, but almost everything that Olmsted and Hall envisioned became a park, and 10, 15 times more. So that's a home run. Just for fun, I just love doing this. Anthony Fisher here, at my request a few years ago, went out and took a bunch of pictures. This is a picture from the Olmsted Hall report. There's like probably 25 pictures in there. It's really cool. If you want a free report, you can have one tonight. So that was Upper Tilton Park. That's what it looks like today. Here is, if you were up on the top of Cannon Drive by the reservoir up there, and you look down onto today's, what we call Jewel Lake. I won't get into that story, but Jewel Lake is a little dry right now. But this is what it looked like in 1930. And then a few years ago, this is what it looked like. So my point here is really just that these lands were, envisioned to be preserved as parks, and they were. This became part of Anthony Chabot Park, Grass Valley, that's it today. And finally, our land close to home, if you came down Cannon Drive by the old pony rides, that's this, the McDougal Tract, and that's what it looks like today. So it's all preserved. Why did it succeed? So I'm going to end with my top 3 points of why did it succeed here and maybe not in LA. And the first is, you could just say there's sort of a dream team of players, people mostly often connected with UC Berkeley, experts, but they had labor, mayors, all the mayors were bought in, the Sierra Club. This Contra Costa Hills Club is not to be minimized because a lot of these guys were mountaineers and connected to UC Berkeley. They liked to hike and they cared about conservation. Whoops, I guess I jumped. So it was kind of that dream team. And then the other two that I would say is we've already talked about these watershed lands. So right where we're standing was part of this Wildcat Creek watershed. Wildcat Diversion Dam became known as Jewel Lake. The other part, I would say, is the New Deal. So when people voted during the depths of the Depression to tax themselves, yes, that was a miracle. However, they also knew, and it was actually part of the campaign materials, that if they passed this measure, that many, many people, mostly men at that time, would be put to work and tons of federal funding would flow in. And so I think that became another key reason why this was created. And then finally, we went on, began our history, probably maybe some of our first conflicts between recreation and preservation, but that's the challenge of our work. Here this is the 1940 master plan for Tilton Park. They call it a playground map. So, and here we are in the nature area. So, and I just end with a beautiful scene, since that's what the gentleman would speak about. And I guess I couldn't resist throwing in one last quote, which is rather long. And this was part of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr.'s speech at Prairie Creek Redwoods when they dedicated the Olmsted Memorial Grove in 1953. And he said, "In dealing with landscapes, I've been guided by an injunction impressed on me by my father early in my professional career, namely that one's primary duty is to protect and perpetuate whatever beauty and inspirational value is due to nature and to circumstances not of one's own contriving, and humbly subordinate to that purpose any impulse to exercise upon it one's own skill as a, quote, creative designer." So I'll sum up with that, father to son, letting nature have the last word. So thank you. Okay, so that is about it. So did champagne already happen, Dave? All right, you guys have had champagne. Well, I've been doing all the work. All right, maybe there's an extra glass somewhere. All right, well, with that, I think we've reached the end of our program. I hope you guys aren't frozen, but thank you for coming, especially to the Olmsted clan and the Hall clan. Thank you so much, and Director Eccles and all the managers here. Appreciate seeing you. Sarah Federley, thanks for hosting us, and have a good night.